William LeMessurier is sitting in his Cambridge office when the phone rings. It's June 1978. LeMessurier is one of the most famous structural engineers in the world. He's just finished designing the Citigroup Center, a gleaming, 59-story skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, his masterpiece. On the phone is an undergraduate architecture student from New Jersey. She's studying his building for a class project, and she has a question. Her professor thinks there might be a problem with the design, something about the way wind hits the corners. LeMessurier is polite. He walks her through the innovative bracing system he designed. He assures her the building is safe. He hangs up, but the question sticks with him. She'd asked something specific about quartering winds. Winds that hit the building at an angle, at the corners, instead of straight on against the flat sides. Just to be sure, LeMessurier sits down at his desk and runs the numbers himself. Hours pass. The calculations start to tell a story he wasn't expecting. His pen slows. He stops. He stares at the paper. The student was right. Because of a cost-cutting decision made during construction, one he didn't know about, the structural joints holding up the 7th tallest building in the world are fatally compromised. If a strong storm hits New York at the right angle, the steel will snap. The entire 59-story tower will topple like a tree, crashing into the streets of Midtown Manhattan. It wouldn't just be a building collapse. It would flatten multiple city blocks. Tens of thousands of people would die, and hurricane season starts in 3 weeks. I'm James Tudor. This is The File on the Secret of 53rd Street. To understand why the Citigroup Center was so vulnerable, you need to understand why it's built so strangely in the first place. When Citigroup bought the land for their new headquarters, there was a problem. A small historic church, St. Peter's Lutheran, sat right on the corner of the lot. The church refused to move. They had no interest in being demolished for a bank tower. So they made a deal. Citigroup could build their skyscraper, but the church had to stay exactly where it was. Most architects would have walked away. LeMessurier saw a challenge. He designed a building that doesn't rest on its corners like a normal skyscraper. Instead, the entire 59-story tower is lifted 114 feet into the air and balanced on 4 massive stilts, each 9 stories tall. And those stilts aren't at the corners. They're positioned at the center of each side. The building literally floats over the church. To keep it from tipping over, LeMessurier designed a skeleton of enormous steel chevron braces, giant V-shapes that run up the sides of the building and transfer all the weight down into those 4 stilts. It was brilliant. It was an engineering miracle. Architectural magazines called it a triumph. But brilliant designs leave almost no room for error. When LeMessurier originally designed the building, New York building codes only required him to calculate wind loads for straight-on winds hitting the flat faces of the tower. But the student on the phone had asked about diagonal winds, quartering winds hitting the corners at a 45-degree angle. When LeMessurier finally ran that calculation, he realized diagonal winds put 40% more stress on those giant V-shaped braces than straight winds did. That still wouldn't be a problem if the joints were welded. Welded steel can take enormous loads, except they weren't welded. LeMessurier dug through the construction records and found something that made his stomach drop. During construction, the contractors had asked if they could save time and money by using bolts instead of welds to connect the steel joints. And someone at LeMessurier's firm, without his direct knowledge, had approved the change. Bolts are strong, but they aren't welds. LeMessurier did the math. He calculated the breaking point of those bolted joints under diagonal wind pressure. The numbers were catastrophic, but it got worse. The building was so light and uniquely shaped that it swayed noticeably in the wind. To fix that, LeMessurier had installed a cutting-edge piece of technology on the top floor, a tuned mass damper. It's a 400-ton block of concrete that floats on a thin layer of oil. When the wind pushes the building one way, a computer tells the block to slide the opposite direction to stabilize the tower. It was experimental, brilliant, and it worked. LeMessurier ran the calculations. If the damper was running, the building could survive a storm that hits once every 55 years. Dangerous, but maybe acceptable. But then he asked himself a simple question. What happens when the power goes out? Because the first thing that happens in a major hurricane is the grid fails. And if the power cuts, the computer-controlled damper stops working. Without that 400-ton weight shifting to stabilize the tower, the building would sway violently. The stress on those bolted joints would skyrocket. He did the math again. Without the damper, the building would fail in a storm that statistically hits New York once every 16 years. Once every 16 years, there was a coin flip that the power would go out. The bolts would snap, and 59 stories of steel and concrete would come down on Midtown. LeMessurier had a choice. He could stay quiet, pray the storm never came, keep his reputation, avoid destroying his career, or he could tell the truth. He flew to New York, walked into Citigroup's boardroom, and told the executives that their brand new $175 million headquarters was a death trap. They didn't call the press. They didn't evacuate. They decided to fix it in secret. First, they installed massive backup generators on the roof to ensure the damper would never lose power. Then they went after the steel. Every day, 10,000 employees came to work in the Citigroup Center. They rode the elevators. They sat at their desks. They had no idea the building was fragile. But every night at 5 p.m., when the workers went home, the building locked down. A crew of welders slipped in. They tore open the drywall to expose the 200 bolted joints hidden inside the walls. They bolted 2-inch thick steel plates over every joint and welded them in place. The torches burned all night. At 4 a.m., they stopped. Carpenters rushed in, sealed the walls back up, wiped down the dust. By 8 a.m., when the bankers returned, the walls looked perfect. Nobody knew. The welding was supposed to take months, but in August 1978, the nightmare walked through the door. Hurricane Ella formed off the Atlantic coast, Category 4, and the forecast models showed it heading straight for New York City. The welding was only half done. The building was still vulnerable. Behind closed doors, panic. Engineers and city officials met in secret. They mapped out an evacuation zone, 10 blocks around the Citigroup Center. The Red Cross was quietly told to prepare for a mass casualty event. LeMessurier and his team sat in the tower, watching the weather radar. If the wind hit a certain speed, they'd have to sound the alarms and run. There was nothing they could do. The survival of tens of thousands of people now depended entirely on which way the wind blew. At the last possible moment, Hurricane Ella turned. It veered northeast, away from the coast, and spun out harmlessly into the Atlantic. New York didn't even get a heavy rain. Inside the Citigroup Center, the engineers exhaled. The midnight welders went back to work. By October, all 200 joints were encased in welded steel. The building was finally safe. In fact, it was now one of the strongest skyscrapers in the world, and the public never knew. There's a reason the secret held so long. The New York press was on strike during the summer of 1978. No reporters, no coverage. By the time anyone thought to ask questions, the crisis was over, and the evidence was sealed behind drywall. The true story, the math error, the midnight welders, the hurricane that nearly caused the deadliest disaster in New York history, stayed secret for almost 20 years. It was finally exposed in 1995 by a journalist at The New Yorker. The story of 53rd Street is an anomaly. It's one of the rare moments where a company and an engineer realized they'd made a fatal mistake and actually fixed it instead of covering it up. But it's also a reminder, those massive towers of glass and steel we walk under every day aren't acts of nature, they're acts of math, and sometimes the math is wrong. I'm James Tudor. This is Empire Archives. Subscribe.